Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations.
Whenever anybody in the church starts speaking about reform, your ears should perk up, especially these days. And there's some calling cards you should listen to, as I spoke about yesterday in a video on this very subject on this channel, which is, do they, in all their talk about reform, rooted in the faith, in you becoming a saint, achieving sanctity, living a holier life, or at the very least, letting sin dominate your life at least a little less than it does now, at the very least? If there's no talk like that coming from would-be reformers, you should pause and really see if what they want to do is make the church holier or make the church more in the image and likeness of their own secular ideology. There are many secularists in the church parading around behind a mask of Catholicism. And the mask is slipping, as you'll see. We've talked a lot in the last couple of years about deaconesses, or deaconettes, as I often call them. One of these reforms they want to impose on the church is this idea that somehow or another the church lost her way over the history of the church and stopped treating women appropriately and said, no, you don't have the rights anymore. We used to ordain you as deaconesses and the rest, but not anymore. That's their thesis. Part of a larger thesis that I usually call the Babylonian captivity thesis. And I'm using that term very specifically, Babylonian captivity, because Protestants have this, at least some Protestants have this theory that, yes, Jesus Christ did found a church, but that church essentially got taken over by Constantine and those wicked women Roman Catholics, and over the course of centuries, the real church hid underground, only to be brought back to light by Martin Luther and his King James Bible. I've seriously seen people say these things. There's a whole contingent of people out there who say this nonsense, and the modernists have their own version of this too. That the Catholic Church is either founded by Christ or the closest thing to it, and it lost its way over time, but thanks be to God, God saved his church with Teilhard Chardin and then later with Vatican II. And boy, isn't Jesus lucky to have us to save his church, right? That's the thinking behind this. It's very arrogant thinking. And part of this Babylonian captivity thesis is that at one time, deaconesses were ordained members of the clergy. Women ordained, not as priests, but still ordained. And that we need to restore this holy order. It's really arrogant thinking that, Jesus is lucky to have us to save his church. Traditionalists get accused of thinking that way too. We don't. We don't think that way. But a lot of the modernists do. You see it dripping in their writings. Here you have an example of this reform talk, which comes in the form, among the modernists, of talk of restoration. And here is an example of that. We turn here to America Magazine, because, of course, why wouldn't we turn to them for this headline? A fourth order for women deacons in the Catholic Church, reflecting on the possibility. In Catholicism, after Vatican II, there are three levels of holy orders: the diaconate, the priesthood, and the episcopate, meaning the bishops. Now they're floating the idea that real reform of the church would be to bring back a fourth level, exclusively for the ladies. That'd be the restoration, quote-unquote, of deaconesses. Before Vatican II, there was a whole host of levels of orders, including lectors, and cantors, and subdeacons, and even gravediggers, and the rest. But Paul VI, in his infinite wisdom, personally abolished those orders in the years after the council. Now, in the spirit of synodality, in the spirit of Vatican II, they want to bring them back based on secular notions of equality, but they're not talking about bringing back subdeacons or cantors as a level of holy orders. They're talking about bringing back deaconesses. When it is my contention that deaconesses never existed in the way they talk about them in the history of the church. And the author of this piece spends a lot of time going over the history of the evolution of holy orders and their various levels, and it is interesting. I will post a link to the article at returntotradition.org in the show notes there for those wanting to take a deeper dive, keeping in mind this is America Magazine we're talking about, and this is written from a very specific angle. But the information is interesting. Just take it with a grain of salt. Modernist history is modernist history, after all. But the author makes the case that throughout the history of the church, the levels of holy orders change dramatically, and that is true, and that they can change again, which is, strictly speaking, true. The author then gets to this. Quote, "At last we arrive at our question. What are the issues involved with the possible creation of a new non-sacramental order of deaconesses? First, it almost seems universally accepted that women have exercised a variety of servant-related functions in the church in a variety of places throughout history. The debate emerges when considering the precise nature of what they did and on what authority they did it. Were they ordained, installed, established, blessed? Historians present different interpretations of the facts. Pastoral practices varied from place to place, and there seems to have been no universal practice. But the fact remains, women were brought into a formal diaconate of some kind. How should that take place today? Second, it seems just as clear that the Church has the authority to take several courses of action, as demonstrated by our historical sketches above. Could a new order be established along the lines of the old subdiaconate or one of the minor orders? There seems to be no impediment to that course of action. Third, does this suggestion of a new fourth order mean a return to a system of major and minor orders in the Latin Church, which was eliminated in 1972? The world's Latin Rite bishops at the council were committed to realigning, clarifying, and streamlining the sacrament of order. Should we return to this now outdated practice? How would this be accomplished? Remember, under the former system, one entered one of the minor orders and the major order the subdiaconate through a rite of ordination, albeit an ordination without sacramental effect. By this I mean no sacramental character was imparted, but it would be an ordination nonetheless. Fourth, would such a proposal simply expand the bishop-instituted ministries of lector, acolyte, and catechist, with an additional ministry of deaconess? However, to me, the author of the article, the proposal of a fourth order of deaconess seems confusing and ill-advised. Why should the sacramental identity of the Church's diaconia be bifurcated with one fully sacramental order of ministry for men and a subordinate, literally, order for women? Will there be parameters placed on this subordinate order? What functions of deacons will not be given to the deaconess, and what will be the theological reasons for such restrictions? Will the deaconess be restricted to ministering to other women, for example? Conversely, will male deacons eventually be restricted to serving only other men? Our history shows a church flexible in pastoral responsiveness as a servant of humanity. Whether the church's ministry with discernment decides to open diaconal ordination to women or not, creating a kind of non-sacramental fourth order of deaconess is not the way to move forward. It suggests that the diaconia can be sacramentally divided, with greater and lesser applications. That is not how the nature of a humble servant church should be expressed in the contemporary church and the world. The church, the whole church, is fully diaconal. Our ministry should express and celebrate that identity." End quote. He never explicitly says we should ordain women. But that's what he's saying. You cannot have a non-ordained diaconate for women. He frames it as a matter of justice. Do you see what he's doing here? Even though, in the history of the church, there were plenty of suborders that weren't formally ordained sacramentally. That is what he is doing. This is what American Magazine is endorsing, subtly. Again, the author of that piece never comes out, he never quite can bring himself to say, let's ordain women formally. Holy orders all the way. But that's what he's implying. He's implying rather heavily that the church used to do this in the full sense, and then took that away. It's been noted here before that the closest that we have to ordained deaconesses and have ever had were these essentially helpers for the bishop. They would do things that it was kind of not appropriate for the bishop to do. Helping out when there were, we'll call them domestic problems in homes for married couples to help the women there, or for the baptism of women, because the way baptisms were done, that it was not appropriate for the men to do, meaning the bishops and the presbyters. Those essentially evolved into holy orders, not holy orders, but religious orders for women, or for consecrated religious sisters, which are not quite the same thing as nuns. There is a difference between a nun and a consecrated religious. But this is how these things evolved over time. It's not that the deaconesses ever really went away, it's that the titles changed and the duties changed. But if you've ever noticed, if you have a parish that has religious who attend, they tend to help out. They often do, or they offer to. And maybe what's needed instead is a reemphasis on the great beauty of women's religious orders, and of men's religious orders too, of and an attempt to integrate them into the nuns, the brothers, the monks, the consecrated religious sisters, into the life of parishes or the life of the actual diocese, to have nuns be public again, to have religious women public again, both in their manner of dressing and in their ministries, meaning having them as boots on the ground in your parishes. That might be a better option to keep it in line with Catholicity and the history of the church. It's a novel thought, I know. There's a lot of novel thoughts going on in the church these days, and none of them ironically novel, like what I just said. Let me know what you think of this in the comments, please. Are you sold at all on the idea that we should have a deaconess that's not ordained? That's the more moderate answer now from Rome that they're looking at. Or are you with this author here of this piece that we should just ordain them because apparently that's what he thinks the church did? Or do you like my idea, which is much closer to what the history of the church is? Or do you think there's not even a problem, which is actually where I really lean? There's not even really a problem. The only real problem is secularized thinking among the laity. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe. If you haven't, certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media, that helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.